Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're welcome to Sharia Intelligence course, and in this episode we will carry on the subject of the maqasid of Sharia, the higher intents, the objectives of Sharia, but we're going to start looking at how the knowledge of maqasid is used by scholars when it comes to dealing with situations that are out of the everyday, ordinary, at least for most people. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss these issues are Brother Nasir Bello and Brother Ibrahim Bello. Jazakumullahu khairan for being with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I'd like to start with Malam Ibrahim Bello. Why is it important for scholars to not just restrict themselves to the knowledge of the text and the context, but to also look at the higher intents and objectives, the maqasid of Sharia, when it comes to giving rulings?
Yeah. It is very important to look at the higher intent or underlying goal just beyond the texts for a number of reasons. Number one, texts were revealed to fulfill a particular objective through understanding the meaning and implications. So in that sense, the objective and the goal behind the revelation gave us focus and direction. The third reason is many texts have no context. Particularly the farther you go from history, you have a missing link. So what keeps us on track is actually knowing the underlying intent, the underlying objective. Also, you look at texts as being part of a whole. How, why, when, what led to this issue of relevance, asbabun nuzul, and some of those things that might be missing, which all need to be put together for us to really know why. So when we have a missing context, or we have some part of information missing, what keeps us on track is actually what? Why? Why? So it is also important for scholars, therefore, to always look at the bottom line. And the only way they can do that is to always look at the basic sciences of usul al-fiqh and the methodology and the qawaid as means to the end. So what I'm saying in essence is they need to triangulate. Whatever you take here, you should know it is leading somewhere. So the importance of usul al-fiqh as a science and methodology of ijtihad, which is regulated and cross-checked with what? The qawaid. But they are all meant to arrive at, they're leading to somewhere. They have a goal, a purpose they want to attain, which is the maqasid. So for this reason, the relevance of maqasid in various areas of usul al-fiqh and in our life generally, and particularly in the interpretation, and for the purpose of practical application of Sharia, cannot be underestimated.
Interesting. So here you're looking at maqasid as another layer in maximizing certainty regarding what was the objective of the text, or what is the fatwa supposed to realize when the text is being used. Malam Nasir, what would you add to this?
Well, I think it's good to just remember, before even getting to the issue of how it is within the context of Islam and Sharia, to remember this fact that text or language or sometimes symbols are a way of communicating meaning and wisdom or intents. And therefore, from the very beginning, meaning or purpose or wisdom is part and parcel of what a text is trying to convey. It's now left for the language use or the text use to be able to convey the message. Otherwise, you need further clarification, you need to expand and elucidate. In a nutshell, text is just a carrier or a vehicle that conveys meaning and wisdom and purpose or intent. Having said that, if you come back to the Islamic tradition, you need the overall maqasid to guide and understand the message of text, because chances are text could fall short, particularly if you are dealing with a single text. It could fall short in conveying the real meaning or the wisdom that is intended, or the purpose that it is trying to carry or convey. And that is even why you find scholars in Islamic tradition emphasizing the usage of, or the approach of a jam, that is bringing together evidences, trying to reconcile or harmonize between evidences to make meaning out of it. Why? Because sometimes a single text might not necessarily convey the whole message, and therefore maqasid becomes a very important quality assurance mechanism, something that you will now use to check whether this particular text is enough to convey the meaning that is within the fold of what is acceptable or what generally the message is all about. So that is actually why scholars feel text alone, the literal appearance of a text and the context is not enough in trying to make sense of evidence and understand the real message that the text is trying to convey. And that is, as I said at the beginning, that emphasized the importance of harmonization, reconciliation of evidences speaking, or text speaking on a particular issue, over elimination or prioritization of individual texts, or the question of abrogation, as the case may be.
So, in a sense, basically, you're also therefore saying maqasid serves the role of a compass.
Exactly.
To ensure that, if an interpretation seems to be facing the opposite direction, then the need to investigate thoroughly what do other texts say, but not to neglect the compass, especially when the compass itself is established by clear text.
Absolutely.
And numerous texts. So it's not an area where there's a lot of doubt compared to the interpretation of a single text. Nasir, on the subject of rulings and interpretations of text, scholars would sometimes differentiate and distinguish between texts or rulings that deal with means for realizing maqasid or means for preventing mafasid, and the actual mafasid, the maqasid, the masaleh that Sharia is trying to either realize or protect or prevent. Why is the differentiation important for scholars, and what's the implication, with some examples, between wasa'il, texts that deal with means, and those that deal with ends?
Two important variables, as you rightly mentioned, the end and the means. You would find scholars mostly talking about this in trying to do ijtihad or come up with a fatwa. And the idea is first understanding what is an end in Sharia and what is a mean, that is what we call maqasid or ahdaf or ghaya, which is talking about purposes, consequences, outcomes, objectives, while the means is such as an instrument that scholars looked at, which is used in trying to realize or achieve the ghaya, that is the objective or the maqasid. And therefore, maqasid is the determinant, is the controller of what actually should be the status of the means. It's the consequences that you look at that dictates to you the value of your means. While maqasid is always permanent, it doesn't change, the means to arrive at that particular goal might change. If the consequences changes, then the implication will now affect the means. And that is why the value, entirely the value of means is tied to the end. Your end is that benefit that you are trying to realize, is that harm that you are trying to avoid. And therefore, if in a particular context, that means that you already know cannot realize that particular benefit, then that has to speak about the status of the means. Meaning the status of the means is determined or is completely dependent on the end. And if you go through the Quran or Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you would find a lot of rulings are tied to this relationship between ends and the means. Ordinarily, you would find means that on their own are permissible, but because in a certain context they may lead to a different end that is harmful, that is haram, and that will automatically affect the status of the means from being permissible to being prohibited. If you look at, for example, the case of alcohol, where the issue of selling, the issue of carrying, the issue of drinking is the means that lead to the intoxication. The Quran was very categorical about the effect, and that is the basis for the ruling of prohibition. And now carrying alcohol, drinking alcohol, selling alcohol as a business is okay, but because it is alcohol and it leads to intoxication, which is the gaya, which is the objective, that makes it haram. Another good example is the case of murder.
So here, buying, selling of alcohol and carrying it is haram.
Yes.
Drinking and intoxication is haram.
Yes.
But what you are saying is there's a difference between the two.
Of course.
One is the mafsada, the harm, the undermining of the maqasid of the aql.
Exactly.
So that is haram. But the carrying and the selling is also haram, but it's not haram in and of itself. It's haram because it facilitates the
something.
intoxication and the
now
drinking.
the question that perhaps might come to mind, supposing this particular alcohol is found to have another benefit that is not intoxicating.
So it's used for hand sanitizers.
Exactly, for hand sanitizers and what have you. Could this implication of selling still remains? Of course, you find scholars saying no. Because now in this particular context, you are certain that the outcome or the mafsada that you are trying to avoid will not be the end result. So this is how you will see variation or the temporary nature of the means when it comes to juridical rulings or ijtihad that scholars usually do. Okay. Another good example is the case of zina, for example. Zina is haram. So in and of itself is haram. But for example, seclusion between people of different opposite gender, the issue of talking, the issue of looking, all these are means to that particular end. Now they become haram because the chances of them leading to that particular end or that mafsada is very high. That is why they become so. And if in a situation where they say interaction between men, people of different gender, in a place where they are not secluded, which is still an interaction, but because the outcome, the chances of getting into mafsada is very slim. That is why scholars will look at it in a different scenario or will say, okay, this is something that is now permissible. Now that is how you would find lots of examples, like again the case of murder.
So just again, so zina is haram and it undermines the maqasid of family and relations, etc. Being alone with a woman in a closed area is also haram.
Yes.
But it's haram because it would most likely lead to zina or facilitate. It's a step in that direction.
Exactly.
But in a situation but this is haram because it's a haram of the means.
Yes.
In a situation where you are still alone with a woman in a closed area, but you are in a lift going to some floor in a building, because that is not leading to the haram,
that mafsada of zina
determines the ruling on the means.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is how you find a lot of examples. If you take the case of riba, for example, where it's a means to exploitation of the poor, it's a means to injustice. That is why it becomes haram. So in a situation where that will not lead to that particular harm, and that is why you see scholars talking about a situation of darura, options that you cannot avoid. For example, you see scholars coming up with different position about dealing with a conventional banking system. Why? Because probably you don't have an option, probably that will not, and that not only issue of riba, but then all other transactions that are rendered prohibited in the Islamic in Islamic finance. For example, issues around gharar, issues around, that is, speculation. You would find this element of leading to injustice, leading to exploitation of the poor, and those are the bases that actually prohibit that particular process entirely. So the point here is, means is always temporary, is dependent or determined by the outcome it leads to. Allahu Alam.
Jazakallahu khairan. And I mean, you started saying something about murder.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Exactly. Another very important example: pointing a gun at somebody. Just pointing a gun at somebody. It's just a means to killing that particular person. But the end, the mafsada is killing somebody. We talked yesterday about, in the other episode, about the value of human life and why you shouldn't tamper with somebody's life, or you shouldn't make any attempt to kill somebody. So now, holding a gun in and of itself, nobody will say, okay, it's haram. But because that will lead to killing somebody, that is the end. That is why scholars will say, no, you shouldn't point a gun at somebody, because that will lead to killing, and murder is haram. So there are a lot of examples. If you go through the Quran or the tradition, Islamic tradition, there are lots of examples that you would find between this issue of relationship between means and the end, and how because you are certain in this context that this particular process or this means will lead to these consequences, which is mafsada, then that makes it haram. Now, if the situation change where this particular means or process might lead to a different outcome or different consequences, you find scholars saying, because it is our sa'il, then the position will definitely change.
So, just to pick on the case of murder and pointing a weapon, we have hadith where the Prophet prohibited pointing a weapon at someone. And that is because you may accidentally harm them, you may scare them. And since we don't want the end, then the means is prohibited. But the actual end we want to prevent is murder. Exactly. However, if a policeman is pointing his weapon at a criminal so that he doesn't run away, or put your weapon down, that is not haram, because the objective is not murder. The objective is actually implementation of protection of society, or protection of justice. So this issue of distinguishing between those things that are haram of means and those things that are haram of the maqasid, they are the mafasid themselves. Alam Ibrahim, what would you add to this discussion?
Yeah, means are always like they lead to the ends. And they need to consider what ends they lead to matters. Usually they will tell you that, like you say, streams flow into rivers, and rivers flow into seas, and eventually ocean. So some minor things are prohibited, they seem minor, but with the end in mind. So prejudice will lead to what? Quarrel, fighting, maybe insecurity, maybe killing, maybe vengeance, maybe war.
Rights, injustice.
Things are like that. Same thing, Islam prohibits indecent dressing, pornography, and all of those things because of what they are likely to lead to. Sometimes also some ends lead to bigger ends. Premarital zina, adultery, leads to even marital, leading to broken home, leading to child abuse, leading to a number of things. So generally, you consider ends and means. But what is important to underscore here is sometimes there is some flexibility in the means if it is meant to protect the end. In other words, you can tolerate changing the means to protect the ends, to achieve the ends. A number of these kind of things are available in Sharia. In the tools of ijtihad, there are some three that are rational or reason-based, logic-based of a thing. You have the maslaha, which is looking at the public interest. You see here, the end in mind is what? What it is going to achieve. You also have istihsan, which is usually considering consequences. Under istihsan, what scholars do here is, if we have a ruling, but that applying the ruling the way it should be will create problem with the end, will clash with the spirit of the law, they will suspend it and modify it to protect the spirit and the goal. This is called istihsan. Sometimes we have saddu zari'ah, which is like opposite. Some other things in themselves may be permissible, but because they are most probably leading to harm, Sharia will prohibit it. So the main thing is, we should be very careful of insisting that we cannot change the means when the reality has changed, including fatwas. In Islam, that's why we have this flexibility of thawabit and mutagayyirat. If there's a change in context.
What's the difference? Thawabit means?
Thawabit are those things that are the ends in themselves. What Sharia want to achieve.
The
what Sharia
stable, fixed.
Exactly, stable, fixed. Why mutagayyirat are the wasa'il. Those things that leads to, they are meant to serve, they are meant to protect. So there is flexibility with the end in mind for scholars, for jurists, for policy makers to always see what means needs to be changed to have a better end. Because this is what keeps Islam relevant all the time. If you move from one environment to the other, their means of achieving a particular goal is not the same.
It's true.
And even cultures, you go to some culture, this is their way of ensuring the marriage is sustained. It's not necessarily going to be in line with the other one. And sometimes some realities change that call for change even in the means. So policy makers, scholars should be aware of this. And that is why knowing these things are important, and ability to differentiate. For instance, use of loudspeakers, they are means. If the context have changed where you have a bigger number and technology has aided, Islam is such a religion that doesn't insist it must be, you must use your mouth to climb a minaret and shout so that people will hear. When you can actually do that sitting with a microphone. Because calling to prayer is seen as a means. The gaya is for people to hear and come. And a number of other things like that, including citing the crescent. Going to search for the new crescent is wasila. The gaya is seeing it. If we're sure we have a more refined and a better way of doing it,
Of knowing when the new month
it's
begins.
born. Exactly. Islam has no problem with all of this. So, but when people fail to differentiate this and insist that Islam is about remaining on everything the way it was done without knowing what purpose it tends to serve, then there will be stagnation. And that's why this area is important.
The risk of stagnation
Yeah.
comes up when all means are treated as fixed, as the ends are fixed.
Yeah.
Where if you treat means as if they were ends, if you treat the instruments and the wasa'il as if they were the maqasid, then when people want to reform, you become an obstacle to the change of fatwas with change in contexts. Now, for many, this is sounding new, that there are some things that are haram, but they are haram of ends. And some things that are haram of means.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is, haram of the ends are stable. Those are usually always haram as a general rule. Unless, of course, somebody is facing darura. But under normal circumstances, you have these haram of ends and you have those haram of means. What guidelines or guidance do scholars follow that come from the Quran and the Sunnah? Especially when we talk about the traffic rules, the qawaid. What are those maxims that are derived from the Quran and Sunnah, and how Islam was implemented at the time of the Prophet, during the time of the Sahaba? What are those maxims that guide judgment in protecting certain harams, permitting certain ones? deciding this is a greater evil, this is a lesser evil. What type of maxims guide scholars in this area? Alan Ibrahim.
Yeah, a number of them, and they form like the guidelines or warning signs in all the verdicts and fatwas issued by scholars. You have al-umuru bi maqasidiha. Acts are judged based on the purposes they serve. And this is very glaring in a number of rulings. Even the Prophet ﷺ chose not to rebuild Kaaba to its original form. The intention was, he was afraid of being misunderstood and Kaaba becoming what the people, everybody will try his own. And you could see in history what really happened when you have a Khalifa who attempted to do that. Another one came and changed it. So the issue of looking at the end in mind. Also, I also cite this example that the Prophet ﷺ once went to Taif when Meccans were hard on him to preach Islam. And he was bleeding really. An angel came around, according to the riwayah, that if you so wish, Allah sent me whether those people could be perished. And the Prophet was having foresight. He had an end in mind, not just these people now. So leave them. I can tolerate, I can endure all of that with the hope that their descendants will be pious and servants of Allah.
He was looking at long-term consequences.
Long-term consequence.
So certain things you can tolerate because of the greater.
Thank you, a lesser harm of a thing. Number two, you have al-mashakka tajlibu taysir. Al-mashakka tajlibu taysir, you're looking at hardship calls for ease, begets facility. Why? Because Islam is looking at, for you to survive and serve God better, is better than wasting your life now. So if fasting when you are ill will be a problem, suspend it, your health first. In other words, safety first. If traveling makes life difficult, Islam is the number of rak'ats. If a number of these kind of conditions, somebody has an injury somewhere, you cannot take ritual bath, you can do tayammum. So generally, Islam is looking at the end, which is you, your life, your safety, before any other thing. You also have adorar yuzal. You know, harm must be eliminated. Victims of racism, victims of disaster. The first thing is, how do you get them out? Forget about, and in these kind of situations, a number of things could be tolerated and suspended just to save life, just to get them out, just to console the victims. Remove the hardship. If they come back to normal people and they are comfortable, they are not under the darura, then other things can follow. Forget about their religion. People need, you know, this kind of what you call emergency support or relief. You also have qawaid like ad-darurat tubihul mahzurat. They all emanate from the same area. Meaning necessities made unlawful things lawful, temporary for that situation. Not because they are still not lawful, but considering the reality. So instances like this, a woman can expose her hawra for a doctor. A man can hug or embrace a non-mahram woman that is falling from a building or in a stampede. You can hug her to save her out of a situation. There is accident, you need to get the victims out first. Similarly, you have rules like they will say yutahammal ad-dararul am lidaf'i dararul khas lidaf'i dararul am, that you can tolerate a minor harm in order to ward off, to prevent or eliminate a bigger one. So you can tolerate minor things, you can do quarantine, you can do COVID protocol, you can follow doctor's guidelines, including don't fast now, okay? Including all those of things, whatever is meant to. The essence, the intent is not now, but the bigger harm. Usually also tolerate private harm in the name of public interest. So if you alone dying will save a community, so be it. Islam is not saying you must die. But if you're in an accident or you are driving and you have to choose between one person dying or killing a number of people, then you tilt toward what causes less life, because survival of the majority is a priority, including if it were to be you alone and many others will survive. This is a very difficult decision to take, but this is the kind of mindset Islam wants Muslims to have.
Always the lesser evil.
The lesser evil. Also, in contracts, you look at what is it meant for? What is the intent of the contract? Rather than what are the wordings? What is culturally understood? Or from the technical perspective of that area, of that field of study, is giving priority over individualistic or word-to-word meaning. You know, that kind of a thing. When somebody would say Black Friday, is it Black Friday they call it?
Yeah.
In finance. Or in medicine, there are some things doctor will call numerical diagnosis. Like if you're not there, you don't say numerical, mean number now. Or empirical now. Like whatever is understood by a group, by a cultural group, by a group of people of similar interests or the same area of specialty. Professional jargons is tolerated because this is a means. It's more in line with maqasid.
Thank you very much for that. You know, a lot of evidence that we should be concerned about consequences and maxims that guide scholars in, you know, choosing lesser evils, identifying greater good. What others can you contribute to on this, Madam Nasir?
I think some of the other maxims that are related to this particular issue, that maxim that speaks about picking the lesser evil. When you are forced to choose between two evils, you look at you take the lesser one. Just in the opposite of choosing between two good, you take the greater good. One of the great scholars of our time, Sa'idi, in one of his books, he talked about it in a poem. He said, وَإِن تَضَاهَمْ عَدَدُ الْمَصَالِحِ يُقَدَّمِ الْأَعْلَى مِنَ الْمَصَالِحِ وَضِدُّهُ تَضَاهُمِ الْمَفَاسِدِ يُرْتَكَبُ الْعَدْنَى مِنَ الْمَفَاسِدِ. That if you are faced with a choice between two goods, you pick the greater good. And of course, the opposite of that is if they are evil, then you take the lesser evil. This is just like in the case of a pregnant woman, that there is this concern that if you didn't abort the child in her womb, she is going to die. And that abortion is a matter of choice between her life or that of the infant that is in her womb. You would find scholars based on this particular maxim saying now it is permissible to abort the child that is in her womb for her to survive. Again, another very relevant maxim is that maxim that talks about whatever leads to haram, it's also considered to be haram. ما يتوافق الحرام عليه فهو haram. That whatever leads to haram is haram. And some of the examples we mentioned earlier about, the Quran talked about it, لا تقربوا الزنا إنه كان فاحشة إلى وساء سبيلا. Those things that lead to the zina that Quran talked about and made them prohibited, like the issue of looking that we talked about, the issue of touching, the issue of a lot of other things actually fleeting around and what have you that are tied to these things that lead to zina, that are means to the zina. Because they lead to zina and therefore zina is haram, that makes them haram. That is what, because they lead to zina, and that is what the maxim is really talking about.
So even if it is not mentioned in any text,
exactly.
If writing a love letter to a woman who is already married is going to lead to something bad, absolutely. So long as it is leading to something bad, it is bad itself.
Absolutely.
And the harm is greater than the benefit.
Absolutely. If you are certain that this particular act, no matter how good it appears, will lead to something that is bad, that is problematic, a mafsada, haram, then based on this particular maxim, it becomes haram, at least in that particular context. Until you are now sure that this act will lead to a different outcome, which is good, then it changed from being, but so long as it will lead to haram, it's equally haram. So that is what the maxim is saying. ما يتوافق عليه الحرام فهو haram. Now another very important maxim is somehow similar to this particular one. this particular one that we talked about, that ma yatawaffaqu alayhi al-haram fahuwa haram, and that one is the opposite actually, where it says ma la yatimmu al-wajibu illa bihi fahuwa wajib. That which leads to obligation, is also considered as obligatory. It becomes wajib.
So the judgment of the ends goes on to the means.
Exactly.
And the judgment for the means is tied to where is it heading. So like al-umur bi maqasidi.
So that was why I said earlier, the consequences, the outcome or the purpose, that particular target is the determinant of the value and the status of the means that lead to it. If it is good, then it becomes good. If it is bad, it leads to mafsada, then it becomes prohibited, just like the end becomes prohibited. Now, lots of examples you find under this particular maxim. For example, under fardu kifaya, it becomes obligatory. It's an obligation on society to have doctors, to have lawyers, to have engineers, and therefore, but knowing that you cannot be an engineer until and unless you go through basic education. Now, basic education of primary school, of secondary school, becomes very, very important and becomes wajib, just like that particular act of becoming engineer and a doctor in a society becomes wajib. And you find many examples around that. Another example that comes to mind, particularly on this issue of weighing the lesser evil, and you can look at it also from the angle of greater good, is the case of Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where Rasulullah made a lot of concessions that some of the companions around felt, why would you do that, Ya Rasulullah? At least we are at disadvantage based on these agreements. But because if you look at the options, if you look at it from the angle of evil, it is a lesser evil compared to this issue of conflict, war, insecurity, and what will come out of it. And therefore, that was actually what Rasulullah looked at in that particular context. And again, if you flip it, the other side, it is a greater good in the sense that it now opened up the opportunity for interaction, for non-Muslims to appreciate the beauty of Islam, for expansion of the Islamic territory and all that. So it is a greater good, and therefore it is worthy of that particular sacrifice and concession. So it depends on how you see it. Now, the last maxim that I think is very relevant.
So just before you go on to this one, I think this point you have just mentioned is really critical. Because some would say it's a lesser evil, it's still an evil, and focus on the evil aspect of a lesser evil. What you're saying is, where you are forced to choose between two evils and you choose the lesser evil, it's because the alternative is worse.
Exactly.
And if you don't choose the lesser evil, you are actually choosing an alternative greater evil. Exactly. That the choice of the lesser evil is actually to prevent a greater evil. Absolutely. So for people who just criticize others who chose a lesser evil and say it is still evil, it is very evil, it is this evil, nobody argues about how evil the lesser evil is. It is evil. But compared to the alternative, you could actually say this is good compared to the alternative, because the alternative is a much greater evil. Exactly. And what you're saying is, Sharia is saying, just as with the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you choose the lesser evil, or you choose the greater good. And a specific harm is permissible, even though it's a harm. You could say what the Prophet did of restricting the what you call agreeing to a treaty that was prejudiced against Muslims, at least individuals, you would say that's not very Islamic. Exactly. However, when you look at the whole picture, the greater good makes it actually very Islamic.
Absolutely.
Sorry to cut you.
Absolutely. Of course, yes. And like you said, if you look at what will be the implication, is it continuous conflict and battle and war between the camps? And what could it lead to? What will be the outcome? What will be the end result in terms of life and property of Muslims and of course the opposite side? And how does it tie to the overall objective of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his prophethood of conveying? I mean, if you look at it from the very business angle, it's about, you are like a marketer, you are trying to sell a product, and now you are fighting, or you've got an opportunity to create an atmosphere where some of the prospective customers of yours trying to ask for certain concession and what have you, and you're trying to say no, you stand your ground. So if you look at it from that particular angle, you will appreciate the wisdom of making these concessions in negotiations, and this, I think, is a very important lesson that presents Rasulullah as a very good leader, a very effective one. And coming back to, if you look at what transpired in history, you could see the benefit of these choices. So the last maxim that is related to this particular issue is this maxim that says, "Ad-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadriha." That it's not all about the issue of concession, the issue of easing things. That basically what this is saying is that even the idea of bringing the idea of proportionality in trying to provide relief to a situation that requires the end requires relaxation. So the point here is we know this particular means lead to a terrible outcome, but in this context it is something that is a necessity, and therefore this means could be relaxed, could be allowed, but to what extent? As we said, that whatever is based, whatever haram is based upon itself become haram. But in a situation, so for example, touching a woman is haram because it's lead to haram, right? Now, in a situation whereby the woman is not well or is sick and she went to a doctor, now because he is a doctor, and now we are talking about necessity, we are talking about life, protection and preservation of life, that particular means that has to do with touching a woman becomes relaxed. But it's not just about relaxing, which you say, okay, in this context it is now permissible. But permissible to what extent? That is opening, exposing the aura of a woman, having him being a non-mahram touch her body. This is
or vice versa.
Exactly, or vice versa. This is a means that ordinarily, because it's ordinarily without any situation, in this particular context, it becomes permissible. Otherwise, it's not. Now, but even with that, scholars, based on this particular maxim, they talked about proportionality. It's not about opening up her entire body, but that particular portion that it's necessary for him to
proportionate to the need.
Exactly, proportionate to the need. And if I didn't forget, if I could remember, there is this case of even permissibility of eating pork or eating dead animal, where ordinarily it is considered haram. But you find some of the companions, Umar specifically, if I could remember, saying it's not about you consuming to the level of satisfaction. If you are in a state of darura where you have to eat these things, otherwise you will die. What is expected of you is to eat to the level that at least it can now quench your hunger. It will prevent you from getting into it. Will take you out of that particular darura. And once that happens, then it's okay. It's not about you relaxing and
a party.
Exactly. So this is actually one of the important use of this maxim and how it applies to this issue of bringing proportionality in terms of applying the relaxations that come with regard to things that are ordinarily considered to be prohibited.
Naturally, one would expect that there are those who, when they hear what you're saying or listen to this discussion, would say, what you are calling saddu zariya is making haram what is halal. What you are calling maslaha and istihsan is permitting what is prohibited. Why? Because you are considering the consequences. And some would say, why should we consider the consequences of rules when the rule is very categorically, clearly mentioned either in the Quran or the Sunnah or the books of fiqh? There's an agreement. Why should we care about the consequences? Why not just do what Allah says you should do? Why should you be thinking, yeah, but it could lead to, it could... Where does the justification for that type of concern for consequences come from when a text is very categorically clear that something is haram, for example?
Now, I would think this is even the norm in Islamic tradition. That idea of concern for consequences, or trying to approach the process of ijtihad within the context of objectives, within the context of, concern for consequences. That is the normal approach of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And some examples of this kind of things is verses where Allah talked about not abusing those who call for somebody other than Allah. وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. That Muslims are admonished not to insult, not to abuse those who are polytheists, those who are worshipping idols. Why? Because that will provoke them, and in turn they will abuse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is an indication of concern for consequences, or is an indication of making rulings while having the consequences into perspective, or allowing the consequences to be the determining factor of a particular rule. Another good example of that is a similar prophetic hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talked about you shouldn't abuse your parents, and the companions were like, how can we even abuse our parents? He said, can't somebody, when you abuse somebody's parents and he abuses your parents, or you abuse you back, that is exactly abusing your parents. So this is another concern for consequences. There are instances where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be asked a question, and he will give answers looking at the context of the person and the probable consequences that is tied to that particular individual. And you would find another person coming with a different outcome. And that is what companions themselves understood in their interaction and their relationship with Rasulullah.
What you're saying is concern for consequences is the Sunnah.
That is the norm.
Yeah.
That is the norm.
That's what the Quran and Sunnah teach.
Exactly. Look at this hadith of لا يصلين أحدكم العصر إلا في بنو قريظة, for example. A number of companions understood in this particular instruction that this is what Rasulullah meant in this particular situation, that we should be fast, we should try and reach that particular place. And if you look at the lives of companions and how great companions like Umar, change because of context, certain established hakam or rulings, then you will also understand, because these are people that lived with the Prophet, that understood the message better than any other person. These are the people that most of the verses of the Quran were actually response to the questions they ask. Sometimes, particularly Umar, sometimes he will imagine something and he will ask Rasulullah, I would wish this and this, and the next thing you hear, a verse is revealed. I think there is a hadith in Bukhari, on 3 occasions this kind of things happen. So this is just to speak to the credentials of the companions when it comes to understanding these things. And then you find Umar on several occasions, particularly, for example, this issue of had moratorium on the issue of cutting the hands of a thief. And this is not just Umar. Even Rasulullah in the context of battle, he did the same thing because of the consequences of doing that, of punishing somebody who steals something during battle, and what that will do to the entire community of Muslims. Or this statement of Rasulullah about not killing hypocrites. Remember the case of Hatib ibn Abi Balta, when a letter was sneaked into the head of a lady to expose the secret of Muslims. When that was exposed, what happened? Umar took up a sword and he said he wanted to kill him. And Rasulullah said, no. Have you forgotten he attended Badr? So, although he did something that is hypocritical, but Rasulullah
treason,
did exactly, that is actually treason. So these are things that are tied to the issue of consequences. There are munafiqun, there are hypocrites in Medina. Rasulullah knows them, but there wasn't any ruling of killing them, for example. So if you look at all this, you then realize that the norm in Islamic tradition is concern for consequences when making rulings, when doing ijtihad. And another very good reason why that is necessary is the fact that texts are fixed, they don't change. I mean, revelation is over, but context does change. Context usually change, and usually if you insist in applying the meaning or the understanding of a text without necessarily considering the consequences, what usually happens? Sometimes the outcome will be counterproductive, will be contrary to the intention of that particular, text. And therefore, and that is why scholars need to be reinterrogating the meanings of these particular verses, the text, and looking at the consequences and how that will be achieved in different contexts. That has, like I said, that has always been the norm. And that is why Sharia look at the objective of, for example, public benefit, which is a priority, which is a maslaha, and trying to look at achieving the maslaha using different provision of tools. Not a single schools of juridical thoughts, or what we call madahib, you would look into without finding provisions made to address this issue of demand, desire for consequences, ensuring that every ijtihad is aligned with consequences. If you look at the Maliki school, you will see them coming up with their saddu dhariya, with their maslaha. It serves the role of trying to align, fatwas, ijtihad processes with these consequences, with this objective, ensuring that there is this, agreed upon, established by qat'iyyu thubut, qat'iyyu dilala evidence that should be respected and should be aligned with whatever comes out of the intellectual and legal effort of a scholar. So that has always been the norm, and that is why you will find scholars insisting that in even trying to understand evidence and text, you have to bring all the relevant evidence, all the relevant text that speaks to this particular issue for you to be able to understand. So it's not about relying on a single text, because usually if you rely on a single text, chances are you are going to drill, you are going to create a problem, you are going to create a mafsada, and mafsada is a big problem. It's something, avoiding mafsada is the entire objective of Sharia. And not only that, you would find scholars insisting on harmony between the letter of the text and the spirit or the objective of the text. And that is only realized, that is only possible if you are conscious of the consequences of the maqasid of the objective, which the overall maqasid that were itemized and outlined and established by scholars are there to guide this process of ijtihad, understanding, interpretation of the text to ensure that they are aligned. So consequences and concern for consequences has been from the very beginning critical in issues of ijtihad in Islamic tradition.
I mean, this issue of not taking a single text is like saying the Quran makes it clear pork is haram and carrion is haram, but it's the same Quran that says فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. Whoever is in necessity, there is no sin. In other words, one verse tells you there's a sin if you eat it. Another one says for a person facing a challenge, in other words, in a person in a different context, the ruling changes. So it's the same Quran that makes the laws, that is the same Quran that tells you where those laws don't apply. And we learn more about that from the Sunnah of the Prophet and his companions too.
Exactly. And you see, the thing is, bearing in mind these consequences and implication will tell you, if you read the verse which talks about, or the hadith which talks about the prohibition of eating pork, for example, and you find yourself in a situation of darura, definitely that consequences will stimulate you to now begin to ask yourself, no, we have to search again. It makes you curious to begin to want to find out what more can you find around this issue, because Allah is just, Allah yuridu Allahu bikum al-yusra wa la yuridu bikum al-usr. This issue of ease, this issue of facilitation is part of the objectives of Islam, is part of the objectives of Sharia. So this concern for consequences will always be reminding you on the need to search more, on the need to want to know, even within the Quran, what are the things that you can put together to make sense of how to negotiate and understand these kind of things in different situations and different contexts.
Alam Ibrahim, what would you add to this discussion?
Yeah, concern for consequences are important. Because when we look at Islam, there are what you call ahkamul wada'iyya and ahkamul taklifiyya, which is just about changing context. Because wada'iyya are more concerned with who, when, how. Take any major acts of worship. Declaratory rules. Any acts in Islam, be it prayer, be it Hajj, and say it is wajib. But as we begin to look at the conditions attached, the rulings change for some people depending on where they belong in the context. Hajj is wajib for who? Who can afford it? You can afford it. The condition is the road there must be safe. You must be healthy. It's only binding when you reach the age of puberty. So same thing prayer. But if you must be free from menstrual bleeding. You must be. So all of these things tell you that, okay, some contexts, some situations change some rulings. This is known ordinarily, even from the nature of the Sharia rulings themselves.
Before we go into Qawaid.
Before Qawaid. So this is number one. Number two, that also goes to tell you that, like they used to say, La yunkaru tagirul hukum bitagir ahwal. That no one will deny now that rulings will change as the situation and context change. Also, that this has been the way of Sahabas. And that's why typically people like Umar and Uthman were not hesitant in coming up with new issues or new rulings or establishing some things new when the context changed. And nobody had problem with it. Uthman established the second call to prayer.
For Jum'ah.
For Jum'ah. Umar changed a number of things. And nobody had problem with him. They knew Sunnah better. And what they actually knew better than us was they were there when it was revealed. They know the purpose it was meant to serve. And that particularly was more with Umar bin Khattab. More so, in Usulul Fiqh, most of these powerful tools that are used to serve as, you call them safety net principles, but they are rational based and they used to serve as a check on other rulings and the products, fatwas that are product of other rulings, are actually based on this change of context. Saddu Zari'ah, Maslaha, Istihsan were solidly derived from Quran and Sunnah. They didn't just come to be on their own, but were a product of overall study and understanding of the intent of Quran and Sunnah on a number of things. يريد الله بكم اليسر فمن كان منكم مريضا أو على سفر فعدة من أيام أخرى. Allah wish is for you. If you are to fast, Allah say if you are ill or you are on journey, don't fast. Okay? If you want to do janaba, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says no water, you can do tayammum. You can see all these changing context and a number of things addressed in Quran makes it easy for scholars to say, okay, if this will be for this, it means in similar situation we can also do this. If the reason for prohibiting alcohol is because of this, so whatever has similar underlying conditions or can make somebody behave the same or can distract people from the service of God, from remembrance, can create hostility, is also haram. All these kind of things, they are very clear and glaring from Sahabas, and they were very comfortable doing that because of what they could see from Quran and Sunnah to be backing the position.
I found what you were saying earlier interesting, something very interesting you said on the implications of the Ahkam al-Wad'iyah, these declaratory laws that regulate the Ahkam al-Taklifiyah, those rulings that this is haram and this is
rulings
farad,
of liability, really.
Those to do with liability, and how, and we discussed this partly I think in Usul, where every hukum, every ruling saying that Maghrib prayer is fard or pork is haram or zina is haram or, all these rulings, each one of them is regulated by the Ahkam al-Wad'iyah, the terms and conditions, the declaratory rules that determine the appropriateness. So even though somebody says eating pork is haram, nobody argues about that, but there are terms and conditions that apply.
Exactly.
And we discussed there the sabab, the cause of that ruling, or what some call the illa of that ruling, the shurut, the conditions, but also the mani, things that negate that ruling.
Yeah.
And as you are implying, darura or haja are among these, situations of necessity, situations of difficulty, are among the mani, among those things that negate the ruling. In other words, alcohol is haram if you are not facing haja and darura, if you are not in a particular degree of difficulty. But the moment you are in a degree of difficulty, the original rules of haram, the terms and conditions tied to that, already tell you this is no more haram because it wasn't haram for people in darura. I'd like to move on related to this, but tied to this concern for consequences. What are some principles? And we will inshallah come into more, discuss this in more detail in a subsequent episode. But what could you say about the way the concern for the consequences of an action affect the degree to which scholars would permit or prohibit things? So the opening of means, say fatwa zariya, or sometimes maslaha, would be used to permit things that are normally prohibited. Or saddu zariya would be, or taqyid al-mubah, restricting of what is permissible, or preclusion, blocking the means, would be used to prevent something that is ordinarily halal because it would lead to something that was greater or harmful and not tolerable. How are these determined, how is this blocking or opening determined by scholars?
Yeah, Sharia is always concerned with consequences. This is what people should understand from beginning. So whatever will lead to haram is haram. We're very sure that for certain this is most likely leading to haram. Sharia is 100% in support of prohibiting it. If we find ourselves in a situation where you need to open up or tolerate, in the real sense, not really open up, some things that ordinarily you say they should be discouraged or prohibited. But we look at, if we don't allow it, we'll be facing bigger challenge. Sharia will say, okay, because of the end in mind, you can tolerate them temporarily. This one is known. So for instance, what do you say about permitting people to have handguns? Really? Handguns? I think there will be more problem than peace. We have more crisis and insecurity than peace than we're having now. So even though it is not categorically stated in Quran that people should, and you can say for security reasons you want to have it, they should allow you. But when the policy makers will look at and say, no, this is more harmful, they prohibit it. What if you have situations where you needed some form of education as a requirement, as a necessity, like basic education, basic biology, basic things, to becoming a doctor, to becoming this? It becomes a requirement that you must study it. Same thing when you have things like minimum age for driving. Like, does anybody have problem with that? No. Because that person is not intellectually competent, intellectually mature. And you're dealing with lives. Same thing, what of marriage? At what age do you give license? So sometimes Islam will even go as far as saying you can prohibit what is permissible. Like you call that taqyidul mubah, or limit it. If there's abuse of polygamy, in the real sense with statistics, and you do impact assessment and discover that it is safer to restrict it, government and policy makers there can restrict it. Islam has no problem. If government is coming up with new policies because of economic challenges that will make sure each salary earner or citizen pay something as a tax, as a matter of necessity to take the country out of poverty and what have you, Islam has no problem with that. All of these things, because you're looking at what is the consequence. And this is why things like Saddu Zari'a, Maslaha, all these tools basically, they are concerned about consequences. Fatwa Zari'a, opening the means, is actually in a way Maslaha of a thing. Saddu Zari'a means blocking the means to haram. Okay? It's just telling you things that were permissible will temporarily become, prohibited, will temporarily become permissible. And sometimes you have what you call qiyasul awla, indirect interpretation. Yeah, Islam did not mention it categorically, but one could infer clearly But if Islam should prohibit this, I think this one deserves more to be prohibited.
Because it's worse.
It's worse. When Allah
By
said,
extension.
فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ, when addressing this issue of obedience to parents, that do not tell them the least word of contempt, like, just his or sort of a thing. Will one say, okay, but Islam did not say you should not insult them, even though you have a verse, a text there somewhere.
Can't beat them.
You can't beat them. No, but this is mafhumul muwafaqa now. It is more in line that if Islam will prohibit this, then what is worse deserve
worse
more
category.
worse category.
Definitely.
So all these kind of things are important for people to know, that the extent to which the harm will determine the extent to which they can prohibit. You can decide to say it's not haram to have a school system with students going to the same class, male and female. But if that's leading to a bigger harm or bigger problem, you draw a line. So Islam look at these things in this perspective with reasoning and with consequence, in mind.
So basically, istishab, the legal presumption, may take it everything is permissible except what is prohibited. And so certain things have not been prohibited. Not from the time of the Prophet, the Sahaba, everybody was doing it, culturally endorsed, maslaha of the time. But once it is clear that in a new context or a particular context, this is causing harm and the harm is greater than the benefit, then the restriction of what is permissible, the taqyid al-mubah, the prohibition of certain things becomes a necessity. What would you end on, Alam Nasir?
Well, I think the interesting thing, if you look at the logic in Sharia about this very important maxim of everything is permissible except that which is prohibited, speaks to the idea of the benefits that, and of course accruing benefit that Islam made available for human beings, and how the idea of prohibition is tied to harm that could be avoided. That is why some sanctions are placed on some things that are ordinarily assumed to be permissible. Now, if you look at it carefully, you would find now that in trying to realize this benefit and in trying to avoid this particular harm, in different contexts, you are required as a Muslim to establish the benefit or the harm. And therefore, vice versa, in the event that this thing is prohibited because of the harm it could incur or it could lead to, then one find himself in a situation whereby the harm that is envisaged here, if not relaxed, could lead to even a greater harm, and that necessitates relaxation. Or in the opposite direction, where the benefit that is actually envisaged or assumed to be available in this particular context turn out to be leading to something that is harmful, then that has been established. That is the first step, establishing this exceptional scenarios or situations about something that is already normal regarding benefit or harm. Then the next thing that scholars or Sharia does is not just to say, okay, this is harmful, this is ordinarily considered to be harmful and therefore prohibited, and now that we realized it is threatening livelihood, it is threatening the stage of darura or haja, we are now opening it up, we are now opening the doors completely. Sharia doesn't do that. Sharia will still go to the next level of measuring and ensuring what level, what amount of relaxation is required in this particular context, in this particular instance. Is it at the stage of something that is threatening, what we call at the stage of darura, for example? Is it at the stage of haja? What is the level of relaxation? So, and that reminds me of the maxims I talked about earlier, that ad-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadriha. This issue of proportionality, even in relaxation of something that is harmful, or the darura itself, and vice versa, the issue of that was discussed by Brother Ibrahim Bello of taqyid al-mubah, the issue of understanding, okay, in this particular context there is a need for certain restrictions because the outcome or the consequences will yield something that is different, and that also key into one of the reasons why consequences are very important, because meaning the text in this particular, generally independent of context, is very clear. This thing is permissible or this is prohibited. But in this particular context, that permissibility, or what that permissibility aim to achieve, which is accruing benefit or avoiding harm, cannot be realized in this particular context. And therefore, there is a need for a shift. There is a need for a shift from the normal or the independent hukum because of the nature of the context. Now it is tied to a context. But in making that particular shift, then you now have to look at proportionality. You have to look at the degree, because itself, relaxation beyond what is required could create another harm. Just as restriction also beyond what is required will ordinarily create another problem. So Islam is very conscious of this sense of measuring, sense of assessment, and I think in some of the subsequent episodes, when we come to talk about this issue of the degree of consequences, we'll now begin to see the relevance of assessment and trying to measure the degree of harm, the degree of benefit, and how scholars usually approach this issue.
Indeed.
Yes.
Thank you so much. In conclusion, I think you've comfortably established that being concerned about the consequences is a requirement of the Quran, is a requirement of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, and the need to have a sense of proportionality, and of course not forget the importance of scholarship, whether it's scholarship regarding impact assessment, whether it's scholarship of the principles of Islamic jurisprudence that apply to this area. I'd like to bring that to the end of this discussion. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you very much. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.